Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Water Online Show. You are in the flow here with Travis Kennedy. I am your host here today, along with my illustrious colleague, Chief Editor for Water Online, Mr. Kevin Westerling. Kevin, we are back and better than ever with one of the best guests that I could have hoped for this show, talking about a topic that is top of mind for many of our readers, many of our listeners, many of our users. Who do we have today and what are we talking about?
We have Amir Cahn, a friend of Water Online, and he's the CEO of the Smart Water Networks Forum, better known to a lot of people as SWAN. And he's an obvious expert in digital technologies and digital transformation.
I think specifically today we're going to be talking about a concept called data as a service, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
We're going to get a little bit more specific in terms of digital transformation. And he's not just a friend. He is, as Stephen A. Smith would say back here in the States and on ESPN, he is a dear friend. So we are happy to have him. And it's exciting because it's off the heels of the SWAN conference that took place in April in Vancouver, which I was happy to be a part of. And I wanted to give Amir, you a chance to talk about some of your takeaways from the SWAN conference, as we called it there in Vancouver, the unconference. And what were some of your highlights, some of the takeaways and some of the thoughts that you have coming out of that? So what would you say was the top two categorical subject matter topics that were discussed in terms of panel discussions or questions asked? What were the top two or three?
Yeah. First, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here. SWAN and Water Online go way back. And Travis is, whenever we do a SWAN conference in the US, you're our prestigious MC, which makes sure everything flows well. So thanks, Travis. I really enjoyed the conference. It was our first time doing it in Vancouver in Canada. And like you said, the unconference format, so letting attendees determine the agenda the day of the event. My kind of favorite things to make it not your typical water conference, we had a cybersecurity role reversal where the utility was the cyber criminal, really involving the audience. Also off the cuff, we had a networking speed dating session where people actually shared their worst dating experience. And I loved the catch boxes. So like these foam squares that people would throw across the room just to see people's reaction. It was great. But I think one of the trends we're really seeing is on the wastewater side of things. So the wastewater track was packed and really all the innovation happening there with AI is really great to see.
Without a doubt. I mean, a lot of the highlights you just talked about, especially the throw box, which was sort of the microphone that we got to throw around around the audience so they could ask questions and we didn't have to go running over with a microphone. I thought it was fantastic and a lot of good topics covered. One of the unique parts about the unconference as well is the fact that there were walk-up songs for the panelists and for those that were speaking. So just a quick side note before we dive into the technical aspects of the topic, what were some of your favorite walk-up songs that were utilized at the conference?
Yeah, so I get some of the credit and the blame. I'm like the SWAN unofficial DJ, but we try to keep it loose and fun. And I have probably two favorites. One was Call Me Maybe for the panel on when customers become advocates.
Carly Rae
actually,
I remember that.
Yep, not quite a classic throwback, but one that takes you back.
It was in Canada. She's a Canadian singer, but like in Singapore, you would have appreciated this. We had a utility panel on digital transformation, and we played Run DMC. It's Tricky.
Oh yeah.
Yes. Now we're kicking it back, right?
Yeah. That got a lot of good reactions.
Absolutely. Especially if you could see the kicks that Kevin's wearing right now, you could actually, although it's not Adidas, I will spill the beans. It's not Adidas, but that's a great choice for a great topic. A good match there.
I do have the shell top Adidas though.
I bet no doubt about it. You are somewhat of a sneaker connoisseur, so to speak, but back on topic.
Yes.
So what are we talking about here today specifically related to data as a service? I mean, maybe it's a good idea to just sort of start out with you, Amir, explaining what it actually is.
Sure. So there's a lot of as a service models out there. It's really confusing. You hear like metering as a service, knowledge as a service, network as a service, software as a service. So really what all these service models have in common is that you're shifting some of the risks that a utility would normally do in terms of like data installation, hardware O&M, the data collection, data analysis from the utility to the technology provider. So it's really different from a traditional model way of doing things. So typically with like a hardware utility would buy everything up front, then often use it like past its warranty. So in this kind of contract, the supplier is actually seen more as a partner. And there's connection and touch points throughout the contract, really regular communication. The cost is actually spread through the entire contract of this. DaaS is really a business model, to answer your question. It's not like a technology. And the other thing that makes it unique is that it's very performance based. So there's often service level agreements which measure different parameters like data uptime, data availability, and there can be fines if people aren't doing their end of the bargain. So really, if you want a common definition, it's seen as a partnership model in which hardware risks in terms of installation, collection, analysis is shifted from the utility to the technology provider. And the utility only pays for the final results that they're looking for. And those results can mean a lot of different things. It can mean just getting the data itself. It can mean summary reports or predictive analytics. But what makes DaaS different than SaaS is that DaaS providers are often like going in the field, getting their hands dirty. So they're the ones who are installing the equipment, making sure it's calibrated correctly. Does that make sense? Like there's,
without a doubt,
it's really like a business model that I think is really taking off.
it's a good distinction to make, right? So it's not basically a commodity based thing. It is actually a business model, as you alluded to, that is a partnership. And the fact that you can spread the cost of it over time, as well as be able to see how the partnership evolves with personnel showing up to make sure that the service is working exactly how it was intended to. It really is a partnership versus a bought and sold commodity. So that was a good distinction to make.
Yeah. And with the understaffing that a lot of utilities are facing, that can probably be very helpful. I'm wondering, is it available, or is it suited for any type of water utility, or is there a certain type of water utility that should get into this?
Great question. So really it can apply for many different applications, water, wastewater. And you would think it makes sense for like a utility that doesn't have the manpower to do it themselves. They would need that extra help. But actually some of the most advanced utilities in the world, like DC Water or PUB, they actually prefer this model because there's a saying like the more you know, the more you outsource. So they know exactly the cost of doing things, and they can have a technology provider do that for them who can scale more easily.
So you touched on something there, and I want to make sure that we don't gloss over it. And it relates to the actual need. So whenever an innovative technology or partnership or thought comes into a marketplace, it's all based around what the actual needs of that industry are. So with that being said, what do you see as the need for DaaS in the water sector specifically?
All right, so let me give you like an outside example. Maybe that will help. So
we love outside examples on this.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's color a picture here.
All right, let's take a step back. Let's look outside the water sector, and you think of some of the most innovative companies you can think of, like Netflix, Spotify, Airbnb.
Mm-hmm.
And what do all these companies have in common? They changed their sector's purchasing model. How you buy CDs, how you listen, watch movies, where you stay when you go abroad. And all these things were met with really strong like resistance when they came out. Like people were saying, well, what do you mean I'm not going to own my DVDs? What do you mean I'm going to have to stay in a hotel room? No one's going to make my bed. And now, like, we wouldn't do it any other way. Yep. And I think you can relate that to DaaS as well. So it's really hard to change business as usual. But we're not talking about CDs. We're talking about water, which is a public good. You need that conservation, that kind of inherent restraint. But at the same time, with the advances of big data, AI, a lot of customers are expecting their water company to be like their credit card company. So if there's a problem, they want to know right away what happened. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not in utilities' core competency really to get all these insights out of all these different sensors. And even owning these sensors can be a burden, because as soon as you own it, you have to replace the battery, you have to make sure it's transmitting correctly. So I think the need is really to shift the mindset instead of, buying all this hardware, people should be more comfortable paying for outcomes, like the movie or music they want to listen to on demand. And really that has to do with co-creation.
Reminds me a lot, and you mentioned some really great companies there. I would consider like Uber or Lyft to be another one that just sort of changed the way people live their lives.
Yeah.
I equated a lot too from a marketing standpoint, not to do a humble brag here, but the way Water Online 20 years ago came in and disrupted the market in terms of if you're going to market and connect in this industry, you're going to have to do it digitally moving forward. So I understand what you're saying, and I think it's a great point to make. But on that same point, where would the idea of performance-based services not work?
Yeah. Well, just back to Uber, they actually look to the water sector because some of their ads say as reliable as your, tap water, which is interesting.
Yes, that's a fact. So the next time somebody's on Jeopardy and they get that question, like that is absolute fact. And I'm glad you brought that up. Go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. So there are certain things that you wouldn't want them to be output driven. Like let's say the gym, that's a subscription model, but your gym's not going to it's not going to be based on how many calories you lose. Like they would just never do that. Although I would like to go to that gym.
Absolutely.
But not every subscription model can be kind of this kind of output driven approach.
Yeah. And as far as getting back to the utility usage, and you mentioned DC Water, can you share another US utility?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of different types. I think there's like the water, the wastewater side. So I'm going to jump to the wastewater side. A really active SWAN member is called the City of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I think they have a lot of challenges that a lot of US utilities could relate to. So they have like 6 to 8 people that do everything. They were using spreadsheets. Their collection system is over 100 years old. And because of what's going on with climate, they were dealing with really unpredictable rainfall and a high burden of ionite and phloem infiltration. So they were faced with these high fines from the EPA for noncompliance. And they realized they couldn't really do things on their own the way that they wanted. So they worked with a DaaS company called ADS, and they were able to help them really go from reactive to preventative maintenance. And the way that they did that is that ADS actually installed and managed their flow sensors. They gathered the insights for Grand Rapids, and they were paying for an SLA of data uptime. So really monitoring the monitoring stations, the rain gauges, making sure that they had like 90% data uptime.
Well, it sounds great with huge benefits, but is there any situation where DaaS could go wrong?
Yeah.
Not to be
so I don't want you. Yeah, like I love that because I don't want to be seen as like a DaaS preacher. Like I for a background, I did a PhD on it, so I could talk to you guys for a while, but it's not a golden solution. It's also not for every utility. Like a utility could have its own internal solutions and not need to outsource this stuff. But a lot of utilities do struggle with big data management. But there are a lot of things that could go wrong in a DaaS contract for the utility and for the technology provider. And one term I heard, I was just in Singapore International Water Week, they're saying, I don't want dependency as a service. And I think that's really key because you can't have like a one-sided relationship. There has to be shared information, and something's going to go wrong. You need contingency planning. Like you need kind of different outs in a contract to say, like, if you're not innovating, I'm going to be able to work with someone else. And let's say you go out of business, I'm going to be able to take my data with me or own those assets.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I would say is that from the vendor side, it's easy not to price your solution correctly and maybe offer like too much, too cheap. And then you're kind of stuck because these are long-term, like 5-10 year contracts. And there's this term you guys probably familiar called like TCO, total cost of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really important to realize, like, understanding the labor costs in terms of making repairs to detect anomalies, how much those will go on throughout the contract versus the cost of doing nothing. And I think utilities don't appreciate that cost of doing nothing enough. And so the vendor really has to make sure it's priced correctly. There could be, like in Australia, there's very stringent cybersecurity regulations in terms of like external cloud storage. So like that would also hinder a DaaS contract. And I think the one that comes up all the time is data governance. So utilities have to not like silo the solution. So they have to make sure that more than 1 to 2 people is getting value from it if it's really going to be a successful partnership.
Yeah, there's two main things that I want to take away from what you said. I mean, what you said checks all the boxes. I mean, the first thing is TCO. What we're finding here at Water Online is that more and more utilities are actually looking at TCO more closely than they did 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that's a plus, right? The total cost of ownership is a factor in everything that a municipality purchases. And that includes a partnership like DaaS. I mean, the other thing that I think is important to note here is that that there's cross-departmental consults that occur within a municipality that weren't happening, again, 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I learned the extent of that at SWAN, at the SWAN conference when it was in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago, about the rise in that. So you're right in the fact that there needs to be multiple entities and stakeholders within a municipality that are benefiting from the partnership. So I think that's a good point to make. One of the things that we are big on here at the Water Online show is simplicity. I mean, you had mentioned, Amir, that you did a PhD on the topic that you were just speaking of, and one of my many PhDs that I'm kidding, I'm joking. One of the things that we'd like to do here is let's slow it down and let's talk about first step. So if you're a municipality out there and you're thinking about learning more about DaaS and what first steps to take, would you be able to set a roadmap up for what the first steps might look like?
Yeah. So one good news is that we created this DaaS playbook. So it actually gives you like a great overview of like how to implement it. But that's kind of like a cop-out solution. I'll give you the
that
real
wasn't
answer.
I was not planning on.
I would say like definitely check out that resource. It's free. It has a lot of great use cases. But I would say the first thing is that you have to define your particular challenges and needs. And that sounds simple, but it can mean a lot of different things. And one, for example, need is how much data do you actually need? And do you need data like once a day, many times a day? Because that will influence your DaaS contract. And what are your particular challenges? And what's really interesting, so I did this global utility survey, and I asked utilities, like, what are their business drivers? What are their challenges to use DaaS? And one really interesting takeaway is that once a utility uses this for one application, let's say like smart metering, they're like 50% more likely to use it for another application like water quality monitoring.
Wow, how about
because
that?
they see the value of the model. Right. So I think it's really about understanding what your particular needs are and then understanding the market and talking to other utilities, understanding different use cases. Like people ask me, because I've now been in the sector for like 11 years, and I think good advice is that you're not limited to your backyard. Right. You can also, there's so many like global solutions, startups like in Europe, all over that are really accessible, and finding out more about those is really key.
Oh, without a doubt. And on that same note, before we let you go, we know you're busy. Wanted to give our audience an opportunity to know how they can reach out to you and if they want to learn about SWAN and what you have to offer. Yeah. So you can share my email afterwards. It's amirc@swan-forum.com. I'm really open to talking. We have a whole DaaS community of practice. So we have quarterly calls where we hear different topics and have different presenters. It's really open. Like I'll give you some cool topics. We had one on like, you don't own me, on like data ownership. Yeah. I love the music tie-in.
Sassy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. You gotta make it creative. People have like Zoom fatigue.
Right.
But then we had like a battle of IoT networks, which was like a royal rumble of like people representing like NB-IoT, LoRa, Sigfox, like duking it out.
Almost like a Survivor Series. Royal Rumble.
But I think that, SWAN's a great resource to check out. So we're the leading global hub for the smart water sector, but we have a lot of great use cases, different reports on also smart metering, energy efficiency. So I definitely recommend checking out the SWAN website, but also happy to follow up with people directly. Without a doubt. Amir, I want to personally thank you for coming onto the show here today and
giving our audience your expertise. For all of those that are watching, listening, that are out there in our audience, I know that I don't want to speak for them, but I do know them well enough to say that they greatly appreciate the knowledge, the input, the information, and the direction moving forward. So Amir, thank you very much for the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Amir.
Can't wait to have you back. And for all of those listeners, watchers, and audience members out there of the Water Online Show, we appreciate you spending your time here with us today, and we will see you next time.